Part 18. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 171. And at this time, after the old beggar outside saw the power condensed in the void, his face began to become a little ugly. At this time, a strange light flashed in his eyes, and then he couldn't help but frown slightly. It's strange. It's really strange. I'm afraid this power is a bit elusive. How can this little guy hide so many secrets? After the old beggar saw this scene, he couldn't help but half squinted his eyes. A special light flashed in his eyes, and then he couldn't help but frown slightly. After a moment, the old beggar seemed to have remembered something, and a meaningful smile suddenly appeared at the corner of his mouth. Interesting, I'm afraid this matter is going to become more and more interesting. The old beggar just smiled and shook his head, staring straight at everything in front of him, with a bit of joking in his eyes. At this time, a surging force condensed so quietly, and the force above the void suddenly shot towards Lin Yu's heavenly spirit cover, scattering in like this. At this moment, in a small world deep in Lin Yu's soul, the old man seemed to feel something. His face suddenly became ugly. At this time, he turned around. Glancing in Lin Yu's direction, the corners of his eyes and eyebrows showed a look of worry. Little guy, I'm afraid you'll be in big trouble this time. After Lin Yu heard the voice, his expression suddenly darkened, and a hint of seclusion flashed in his eyes, and he couldn't help but frown slightly. What's going on? Something happened. A bitter smile appeared on the corner of the old man's mouth, and a hint of helplessness flashed in his eyes. Something big has happened. Senior, please speak. That guy jumped over the wall and wanted to kill you. When Lin Yu heard what the old man said, a complicated light flashed in his eyes, and then his brows knitted together. What? That hateful guy actually wants to kill me, damn it. But at this time, the old man's face became so relaxed after this moment, and he turned his head and glanced at Lin Yu. Little guy, actually you don't need to worry. This guy can't do anything to you. My magic circle is still there. On the contrary, this time is actually an opportunity for you. When Lin Yu heard what the old man said, a special color flashed in his eyes. At this time, he couldn't help but raise his eyebrows slightly, and there was obvious excitement in his eyes. How do you say this? The old man just smiled like this, simple. That guy was so smart that he was fooled by his cleverness. He wanted to take the things I left you as his own, but he didn't look at how much he weighed. This time he wanted to. If you fail to steal the chicken, you will lose the rice. You pretend to be silent for the time being, and he will naturally show his weakness after a while. After the old man finished speaking, he disappeared in front of Lin Yu. At this time, in Lin Yu's sea of consciousness, the man's eyes flashed with confusion, and then he couldn't help but shook his head slightly, and his brows seemed to be knitted together. Same. After seeing this scene, Lin Yu also had a meaningful smile on his lips. And just after this moment, Lin Yu seemed to suddenly remember something. You must know that this ordinary person may only have one sea of consciousness, but this time he obviously has two seas of consciousness, which is really a bit weird. When Lin Yu thought of this, a bit of confusion flashed across his eyes and brows. At this time, he couldn't help but frown slightly and shook his head. Why is there still this small world in my soul? Is it possible that it is precisely because my soul is so special that it was selected by the system and the way of heaven? After Lin Yu thought of this, a bit of excitement flashed in his eyes. At this time, the corner of his mouth also raised a smile, and then he nodded one after another. That's right, it must be like this, it must be like this. He must have chosen me because of my small world in the sea of consciousness. In this case, it really makes sense. When Lin Yu thought of this, he nodded with satisfaction, his eyes aroused some complex colors, and just a moment later, a figure suddenly appeared in front of Lin Yu. This was the old man who disappeared earlier. After seeing Lin Yu like this, the old man's eyes evoked some meaningful brilliance. At this time, the old man also sighed heavily, and then he couldn't help but shake his head. Well, actually knowing this so early is of no benefit to you, especially in this small world. Once you know about it, you will leak out the secrets, so now I am ready to erase your memory. When Lin Yu heard what the old man said, his face suddenly turned ugly. His eyes were fixed on the old man, and then he shook his head crazily. Senior, no. After hearing what Lin Yu said, the old man just took a deep breath, with a look of helplessness in his eyes. Don't blame me for some things. At this moment, Lin Yu seemed to have suddenly realized something, and the old man casually drew a few laws in front of him, and then a stream of light directly sank into Lin Yu's head. After a moment, Lin Yu lost his consciousness. The old man stared at Lin Yu with his eyes wide open, and a few meaningful smiles appeared at the corners of his mouth. Alas, you can't blame me. Everything depends on your fate, you can't say it, you can't say it. When the old man said this, it was only a moment, and Lin Yu instantly returned to his sea of consciousness. At this time, Tiandao sat cross-legged in front of Lin Yu, he pinched his hands and chanted the spell, and silently recited the law, but even so, the cold sweat on his forehead was flowing heavily. That day, he felt the original power of the heavenly Dao in his body pouring into Lin Yu, but his soul had no way to enter Lin Yu's body. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 172. Lin Yu's expression froze slightly. When he felt the surrounding environment, a look of solemnity flashed in his eyes, and then his brows couldn't help but sink slightly, and then they were half squinted. Eyes. Interesting, this time is really interesting. I should be able to bear it now. In this case, it is better to use the plan first. After Lin Yu thought of this, a bit of amusement flashed in his eyes. At this time, he half squinted his eyes, and there was a somewhat complicated look in his eyes. At this moment, Lin Yu held his breath and concentrated, qi sinks in Danshan, and spirit gathers in Zifu. After a moment, Lin Yu's face became pale and suddenly became ugly, because he could clearly feel the mysterious power quietly gathering in his body. Come. Just after this moment, the surrounding world actually started to quietly gather together in one place, and this area of the world actually began to look at it vaguely. After Tiandao saw this scene, his eyes were full of excitement. At this time, he seemed to feel a powerful and ethereal force, so quietly condensed around his body. After Lin Yu saw this scene, his eyes were quite excited. At this time, he nodded with satisfaction, and the smile at the corner of his mouth began to become more and more obvious. Then a figure rushed towards Lin Yu. It was the way of heaven, but there was already a way of heaven in front of Lin Yu. At this moment, after the way of heaven appeared in front of Lin Yu's expression suddenly became ugly. When the phantom arrived, Tiandao turned his head and just glanced coldly at the phantom. How did you go about what you were asked to do? Tiandao's eyes were fixed on the phantom, with a bit of complexity in his eyes. And the guy who just passed by had a meaningful smile on his face. What do you think? You are so wise and powerful, and you know everything like a god, so it is not difficult to deal with this guy. The man's eyes were fixed directly on Tiandao. Tiandao was also satisfied and nodded. Then with a thought, the guy directly integrated into Tiandao's body. After seeing this scene, Lin Yu's eyes were quite complicated at this time, but he did not dare to show anything at this moment. After all, he wanted to see what Tiandao wanted to do. Tiandao didn't seem to be aware of Lin Yu's abnormality. At this time, his expression gradually became ferocious. A smile appeared on the corner of his mouth, and then he suddenly stepped forward. He came to Lin Yu's side in one step and stared at Lin Yu's body. Ha ha ha, little guy, no matter what this time, you won't be able to escape from my grasp. So what if the old guy wants you to inherit the power of heaven? He can't calculate against me even if he doesn't. Ha ha ha. Tiandao's face was filled with a kind of madness, and at this moment, after Lin Yu saw this scene, his eyes were quite complicated, his brows were furrowed, and then he sighed quietly. After a moment, Tiandao seemed to understand something. At this time, his face suddenly became ugly, and then he couldn't help but take a breath, and his eyes were even more, quite a bit of fear. At this time, Tiandao frowned, and then he couldn't help shaking his head so crazily. After a while, Tiandao turned his head and glanced towards Lin Yu. When he saw Lin Yu's soul was still in his thoughts. At this time, Tiandao's eyes narrowed to a slit, and a strange light flashed in his eyes. Then he forced a smile out of the corner of his mouth, and his eyes were full of helplessness. I lost. It seems that I am the loser after all. I was a wise man, and I was confused for a while. In the end, I became confused like this. Alas, I have nothing to say, nothing to say. After Tiandao finished speaking at this time, a helpless smile appeared on the corner of his mouth, and his eyes were full of helplessness. And a moment later, Tiandao seemed to understand something. He suddenly took a step forward, and then he made a hand seal with both hands. As soon as the thunder came, he moved towards Lin Yu's head. It was chopped like this. After the old beggar outside saw this scene, his pupils suddenly enlarged, and his eyes were even more panicked. At this time, Bai Shui didn't care so much anymore, he let out a scream, and then he rushed towards Lin Yu. But Bai Shui's affection was directly nailed in the air by the old beggar. The old beggar turned his head and just glanced at Bai Shui coldly. Then he sighed heavily and shook his head. The bitter smile on the side began to become more obvious. Hey, why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? If you go there now, you will only cause trouble for him. You can't help him in any way, believe me. The old beggar stared at Bai Shui with a complicated look in his eyes. At this time, Bai Shui stared at the old beggar with her eyes, and her brows seemed to be tightly knitted together. What's going on? I hope you can tell me so that I can be prepared. Bai Shui stared at the old beggar with her eyes, and the old beggar just shook his head and smiled. There are many things that I can't tell you in detail, but there are also many things that I can't explain clearly. The old beggar turned his head and stared at Bai Shui with his eyes, and Bai Shui at this time seemed to suddenly understand something. Just after this moment, her whole momentum became weak. No thanks this time, right? Bai Shui turned around and stared at the old beggar with a complicated look in her eyes. At this time, the old beggar looked up at the sky and sighed heavily, with a helpless smile on his face. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji-Sheng Chong. Chapter 173. Now I can only take one step at a time, and now I can only look at the fate of this little guy. If this little guy has enough opportunities, he might be able to barely survive. If the fate of this little guy is not enough, then... The old beggar paused when he said this, and at this time, Bai Shui's bitter smile at the corner of his mouth began to become more and more obvious. Bai Shui just nodded helplessly. It seems there is no solution to this matter. The old beggar also nodded gently. There is really no solution. The people this little guy provoked this time are really terrifying, a bit scary, so in this case, I am really helpless. The old beggar's eyes were quite a bit graceful. At this time, after Bai Shui heard what the old beggar said, he also turned his head and stared straight at the old beggar. The beggar seemed to be quite confused in his eyes. Why is this so? Bai Shui's eyes were fixed on the old beggar, and at this moment, the old beggar suddenly smiled. He just smiled and waved his hands. Some things can't be explained or explained. They are quite complicated anyway. If you don't understand it now, then maybe you will be able to understand it in the future. The old beggar turned his head and looked into the distance. He just glanced coldly. The complicated meaning in his eyes became more and more obvious. But after a moment, Bai Shui seemed to suddenly as if he remembered something. What is going on with this heavenly way? How does he have a relationship with Lin Yu? I don't understand, I don't understand. At this time, after hearing what Bai Shui said, the old beggar also had a bitter smile on his lips, and his eyes were full of helplessness. This matter of heaven is very important, so I can't tell you the reasons and the whole story now, but when I can tell you in the future, I will definitely tell you all this. Bai Shui's eyes were staring straight at the old beggar. At this moment, her beautiful eyes were full of confusion, and she had no idea what kind of medicine this old beggar was selling in his gourd. And a moment later, the old beggar just smiled slightly after seeing Bai Shui like this. Curiosity will kill the cat. Your curiosity will not do you any good. Listen to my advice and put this matter aside for the time being. Don't ever take a trip into this muddy water again. It's not good for you. There's really no benefit at all. Although Bai Shui was unwilling at this moment, there was nothing she could do. The two girls Qiu Yao and Ya Ya took a step forward at the same time. At this time, the two girls looked at each other. Stop pretending and being mysterious here. He is very important to us, Bai Shui, so if you have any idea, senior, please find a way to help. The old beggar heard this. After the two of them finished speaking, a wry smile appeared on the corners of their mouths, and there was a look of helplessness in their eyes. There are some things that I really can't help. The past has been scattered with the wind, and smoke is rising everywhere. In that war, the law of heaven was dead, and Huangtian should stand, but this Huangtian Ho soil is originally for the people of this world and the human race. Helping Huangtian Li, and the Beast clan supports the heavenly way, so now the Beast clan is driven by the human race. This is the secret of this world, and what this little guy is now involved is the secret of this world. After the old beggar said this, he kept silent and closed his eyes to rest. At this moment, Lin Yu was surrounded by thunder and lightning, and the old beggar never said a word again. At this time, the hearts of several women seemed to be lifted up. Their eyes were staring straight at everything in front of them, and there was a bit of helplessness in their eyes. At this time, their whole hearts were filled with excitement. This raised his throat. At this time, the fists of these women were clenched together, and there was a bit of panic in their eyes. At this time, all the people were looking towards the old beggar. The old beggar's face was slightly condensed, and a few meaningful gleams flashed in his eyes. After waiting for this moment, the old beggar seemed to suddenly remember something. He suddenly came to Lin Yu's side, and then immediately raised Lin Yu's arm. When he saw when the 9 dragon shadows were looming on Lin Yu's arm, some profound solemnity flashed in the old beggar's eyes. At this time, the old beggar nodded with satisfaction, his eyes were full of excitement, and the corners of his eyes and brows were full of joy. As expected, it is indeed so. I said that this little guy is not a mortal. Sure enough, I can see this little guy today. He is really not something that ordinary people can compare to. In this way, it is really good. At this time, the old beggar's eyes were full of excitement. At this time, he was so excited that he was somewhat incoherent. The 3 women turned their heads and glanced at the old beggar, a bit of confusion flashed in their eyes, and then they couldn't help but raise their eyebrows slightly. What's going on? Why do you look so strange? The 3 women turned their heads and stared directly at the old beggar, with a different kind of brilliance flashing in their eyes. At this time, the old beggar also suddenly laughed. He turned his head and looked at the 3 women, and then pointed at the flying dragons on Lin Yu's wrist. The 3 women were like monks, confused and had no idea what the old beggar was up to. At this time, they looked at each other, their eyes fixed on the old beggar. "Old senior, what do you mean by this? We don't quite understand." At this time, the old beggar suddenly laughed. He laughed very happily, as if he had encountered the happiest thing in the world. The three women looked at each other, and they were quite speechless in their hearts, but they didn't show anything at this time. This is the mark of heaven. Heaven is the supreme 9 dragons. Look at the golden dragons on his wrists. They all have 10 claws. 10 represents the beginning of all things. Heaven and earth are one, which is more important than the vastness. Obviously, heaven has given him a good fortune. This little guy will surely rise to prominence in the future. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Sheng Chong. Chapter 174. After hearing what the old beggar said, the three women looked at each other in disbelief. After seeing this, the old beggar just shook his head and smiled, then waved his hand gently. "You don't have to put on this expression, what I said is true, this little guy will probably be able to rise to prominence soon." The old beggar turned his head and stared at the three women. At this time, the three women turned their heads and stared at the old beggar, feeling so much in their hearts. Their eyes were fixed on the old beggar, and the old beggar suddenly laughed. "Three girls, there are some things that I can't say more, but remember one thing." After hearing what the old beggar said, the three women nodded heavily, and their eyes were quite complicated. "Please speak, senior." At this time, the old beggar turned his head and looked at the three women, with a hint of a meaningful smile on his lips. "In the future, you will assist him wholeheartedly, and then you will have a place in the world," the old beggar said slowly, and the three women looked at each other after hearing what the old beggar said. For a moment, they really didn't know what the old beggar was up to. At this time, the old beggar just walked away with his hands behind his back. After a while, the three women came back to their senses. What does this old senior mean? Assist him wholeheartedly, how to concentrate, and the word Buddha is clearly a word that only the emperor can use. Qiu Yao analyzed slowly, and Bai Shui seemed to have a complicated look in her eyes after hearing what Qiu Yao said. Maybe he can really become an emperor in the future, it's hard to say. Bai Shui's eyes were fixed on Qiu Yao. And at this moment, Qiu Yao seemed to remember something. "Do you remember what our master said back then?" Qiu Yao just talked about this for no reason. And at this moment, Bai Shui heard Qiu Yao say this, and her eyes seemed to be a little complicated. "Master seemed to have said that we will meet a real dragon in this life, but our life will probably be very bumpy. However, if we wait for the real dragon to ride the wind and soar up to 90,000 miles in the future, then that will be our day to come out." At this moment, after hearing what Qiu Yao said, Bai Shui nodded with satisfaction, with a little complexity flashing in her eyes, and a hint of a meaningful smile at the corner of her mouth. "That's right, this time it's like a real dragon taking the wind and transforming into a human form, soaring up to 90,000 miles, rising to the sky in one day, and all the mountains and peaks will come to pay homage." Qiu Yao's eyes seemed to be quite complicated. At this time, Yaya seemed to be standing still. After listening to the women's words, her eyes were full of confusion, and then she couldn't help scratching her head slightly. "Sisters, what do you mean by this?" Bai Shui and Qiu Yao looked at each other, then turned their heads and glanced at Yaya, with a few meaningful smiles on their lips. "You silly girl, come and guess it." At this time, Yaya was like a monk who was at a loss, and couldn't figure out what Bai Shui meant, so she turned her head away angrily. At this time, Bai Shui and Qiu Yao smiled at each other, but at this time, the deep sadness in their eyes could not be concealed. Although that is the case, some of these things are probably. Everyone could feel the worry in the eyes of Bai Shui, Qiu Yao, and Yaya. And at this moment, in Lin Yu's sea of consciousness, A man stood with his hands behind his back, staring at Lin Yu with a complicated look in his eyes. At this time, a faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Then, the thunder in the void hit Lin Yu's head. When the women saw this scene, they screamed, and their eyes were full of panic and fear. Bai Shui wanted to rush over, but was stopped by the old beggar. The old beggar turned around, looked at Bai Shui, and then shook his head. "Look at him now, you should know that he is fine." After hearing what the old beggar said, everyone looked at Lin Yu at the same time. Sure enough, Lin Yu was lying there quietly as if nothing had happened. After seeing this scene, the women's eyes flashed with some complexity, and their eyes and eyebrows outlined some worries. But even so, what if something really happens in a while? The old beggar turned his head and glanced at Bai Shui, with a meaningful smile on his lips. "God protects me, believe me, nothing will happen to him." There was quite a bit of determination in the old beggar's eyes. At this time, after Bai Shui heard what the old beggar said, she felt quite worried in her heart. After a moment, a wry smile appeared on her lips. "If that's the case, fine, let me borrow your good words, senior." After hearing what Bai Shui said, the old beggar turned his head and glanced in his direction, with a smile on his lips. "There is no need to be so reluctant. I believe that this little guy like me is very lucky and nothing will happen to him. At least not today." Bai Shui nodded gently. At this moment, Tiandao was extremely angry in his heart, but he still suppressed the anger in his heart. At this time, a sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth, and a bit of coldness flashed in his eyes. "What's the point of pretending to be dead like this? I know you've woken up a long time ago, and you should have seen the old guy. Do you still want to continue pretending now?" Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 175. At this time, after Lin Yu heard what Tiandao said, a faint smile appeared on the corner of his mouth, and then he stood up slowly, with a look in his eyes. "It's a bit playful. Oh, it's really no fun, you almost broke my old bones." At this time, after Tiandao heard what Lin Yu said, he felt as if he was facing a formidable enemy. His eyes were fixed on Lin Yu. The cold light in his eyes was as if he wanted to kill Lin Yu. It was like being completely eaten alive. "Boy, don't pretend to be a ghost here. If you dare to pretend to be a ghost here again, believe it or not, I will kill you right now." At this time, after hearing what Tiandao said, Lin Yu suddenly laughed. After this moment, Lin Yu seemed to have remembered something, and there was something in his eyes. "Quite a joke. If you could kill me, wouldn't you have done it just now? Why would it be so troublesome? But you didn't do it just now, so you can't do it?" Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on Huang Tian. At this time, Huang Tian suddenly laughed. Even he had to admit that what Lin Yu said was indeed true. But even so, if Lin Yu wanted to make a mistake in front of him, it would be a mistake. An impossible thing. Huang Tian's eyes flashed with murderous intent. At this moment, his eyes darkened, a sneer curled up at the corner of his mouth, and a cold light flashed in his eyes. "Boy, although I have to admit that what you said is indeed true, but so what? If I kill you, it would be extremely simple." Huang Tian's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu's body, and the murderous intent on his body was even more looming. At this time, Lin Yu just waved his hand casually, with a bit of contempt in his eyes. Huang Tian's eyes suddenly sank, and he suddenly took a step forward. In just a moment, he was already in front of Lin Yu. However, Lin Yu's expression at this moment was quite calm. He watched Huang Tian's fist getting closer and closer to him, but it still remained motionless, as if the mountain was falling and not moving. At this time, Huang Tian suddenly waved his hands, his eyes were quite cold, and a cold and stern aura suddenly emanated from his body. That cold aura was gradually spreading. Lin Yu seemed to remember something just between his breaths, and he suddenly took a step forward. Then, a cold fist wind emanated from his body. There was a dragon roar and a long roar, followed by the time and space beasts, and the spirit of the dragon suddenly appeared in front of Lin Yu. Their eyes widened with anger, and their eyes were fixed on the person in front of them. At this moment, after Huang Tian saw the space-time beast and the dragon spirit, a disdainful sneer appeared on the corner of his mouth, and his eyes were full of contempt. Huang Tian's eyes were fixed on the dragon spirit. After a moment, a cold smile appeared on the corner of his mouth, and his eyes were quite murderous. The divine dragon spirit twisted its huge body, just breathing and exhaling, as if he suddenly understood something. Without saying a word, he suddenly moved towards the divine dragon spirit. This way, coming straight. In just a brief moment, the dragon spirit suddenly flicked its tail. At this moment, after Huang Tian was hit by the dragon spirit, he suddenly flew backwards towards the back, but a moment later he flew backwards. It just fell heavily to the ground. But a moment later, the divine dragon spirit flew out again, preparing to attack Huang Tian again, but at this time Huang Tian stepped back one after another. After retreating for a long time, it was regarded as reluctant. He stabilized his figure. But at this time, Huang Tian suddenly grabbed the tail of Shenlong Zero, and then Huang Tian swung it into a round shape, and then flew the Shenlong spirit directly out, and the Shenlong spirit fell to the ground. Followed by a huge burst of sand and dust. The divine dragon spirit who had done this felt a surge of blood and energy in his body. After a moment, the divine dragon spirit coughed out a mouthful of blood. Huang Tian once again stormed towards the dragon spirit. At this time, he was extremely fast. In just a moment, he had already arrived in front of Lin Yu. In just one breath, the divine dragon spirit was rounded up by Huang Tian and hit Lin Yu and the space-time beast. However, Lin Yu did not move at this moment. He grabbed the divine dragon spirit. The dragon horn of spirit. Don't forget, if I were in this big world, I would definitely not be your opponent, but now this is my small world. If you want my life, should you think about what you will do? Do you have such ability? Lin Yu was talking unhurriedly, and at this moment, after Huang Tian heard what Lin Yu said, a cold light flashed in his eyes, and the murderous intention in his body quietly emerged. Come out. After a moment, Huang Tian suddenly smiled. Ha 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 ha, little guy, you are somewhat capable. Yes, in your sea of consciousness, I am afraid that I may not be your opponent, but even so, what can I do? Still the same sentence, if I want to kill you, it will be easy. Lin Yu half squinted his eyes, really? At this time, Lin Yu drew a mysterious magic circle in front of him, and then the space-time beast passed through the magic circle. At this time, the time-space beast suddenly opened its mouth, and the next second it after teleporting to Huang Tian, she bit through Huang Tian's shoulder. Huang Tian let out a muffled groan. Just after this moment, Huang Tian's eyes widened with anger. In a moment, he came to Lin Yu, and then suddenly raised his palm. But before his palm fell, Lin Yu grabbed his palm first. At this time, Lin Yu suddenly smiled. The excitement in his eyes began to become more and more obvious. The scene for a moment gave Huang Tian a shuddering feeling. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 176. You kid actually dare to disobey the law of heaven. With the first throw, are you seeking death? Huang Tian's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu. At this time, Lin Yu suddenly laughed like this. He smiled happily, as if he had encountered the funniest thing in the world. Tiandao's face suddenly turned ugly. The murderous intention in his body was revealed like this, and a cold aura emerged from his body like this. I don't know whether I want to seek death or not, but I know that you are definitely no match for me now. If you know better and leave quickly, I might even give you a chance to survive. If you continue to be so stubborn, then don't blame me. You're welcome. Lin Yu was talking like this unhurriedly, and at this time Huang Tian also laughed like this after hearing what Lin Yu said. At this time, he seemed to have heard the funniest thing in the world. It's the same joke, and I can't stop laughing. I am the Dao of heaven. Are you threatening me like this? Kang Tian is dead and Huang Tiandang is standing. Everything now is given to you by me. The slaves of the orcs and the orcs. This is also the rule set by me. Now this human race is so ungrateful, damn it. When Lin Yu heard what Huang Tian said, he turned around and glanced in his direction. A sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth. A bit of coldness flashed in his eyes. The murderous intention flashed out even more vaguely. After the cold murderous intention was revealed, it seemed to make people feel a little chilling. And just after this moment, a figure suddenly flashed out. The figure was extremely fast, and in just a moment, it had already arrived in front of Huang Tian. At this time, Huang Tian's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu. The two people looked at each other, and a cold aura was directly revealed from Huang Tian's body. In this brief moment, Lin Yu seemed to suddenly understand something. He suddenly took a step forward, and then immediately made a hand seal with his hands. A majestic and vast power emitted from his palm. At this moment, Huang Tianke began to realize how terrifying the strength of the little guy in front of him was. At this moment, Huang Tian saw after this scene, a bit of complexity and solemnity flashed in his eyes. And after a moment, Huang Tian seemed to have remembered something. His eyes were fixed on Lin Yu's body, and a cold murderous intention was revealed without reservation. The killing intent gave everyone a shuddering feeling. Huang Tian laughed loudly, ha 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 ha, it seems that you are not ready to die yet, but if one day you can advance to the divine realm, then your death will be over. After Huang Tian finished speaking, he disappeared directly in front of Lin Yu. At this time, after Lin Yu heard what Huang Tian said, his eyes stared straight at the direction where Huang Tian disappeared for a long time. Only then did he look back leisurely, and a bit of helplessness flashed in his eyes. After a moment, Lin Yu suddenly took a step forward and reached Huang Tian. His speed was extremely fast, but at this time, Huang Tian had already disappeared into the sea of his consciousness. At this time, Lin Yu stared directly at Huang Tian, who was gradually disappearing in front of him. There was a bit of complexity in his eyes, and then his brows locked together and he sighed heavily. Alas, everything is fate. Everything is caused by nature. It's impossible to explain, it's impossible to explain. At this time, the time and space beast and the dragon spirit came to Lin Yu's side. The time and space beast turned its head and glanced at Lin Yu, with a bit of confusion flashing in its eyes. What's wrong? How did you get into trouble with Huang Tian? At this time, the dragon spirit looked at the direction where Huang Tian disappeared for a long time, and after a while, he slowly withdrew his gaze. There was clearly some killing intent in the dragon spirit. After Lin Yu felt the killing intent in the dragon spirit, a faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. You should hate him very much. After all, the former king of the dragon clan has now been driven by others. No matter who it is impossible for him to feel better. Lin Yu's eyes were fixed directly on the divine dragon spirit, and at this moment, the divine dragon spirit suddenly smiled and waved his hand so gently. Impossible, who is he? Why should I hate him? Judging from his current situation, he doesn't deserve it at all. The voice of the divine dragon spirit suddenly appeared in Lin Yu's sea of consciousness. At this time, after hearing what the divine dragon spirit said, Lin Yu suddenly laughed. He laughed so hard I was very happy, as if I had heard the funniest joke in the world, and I couldn't stop laughing. At this time, after seeing this scene, the Shenlong spirit's face suddenly became ugly. The eyes of the dragon spirit were fixed on Lin Yu, and a murderous intention quietly began to emerge from his body. That cold aura made everyone feel a sense of a chilling feeling. After a moment, Lin Yu suddenly took a step forward. At this time, the old beggar looked at the smoke and clouds in the sky, and his eyes were obviously excited. At this time, the old beggar was ecstatic, his eyes were full of excitement, and the excitement in his heart was even more difficult to conceal. Great, it's so great, I didn't expect it, I never thought that this little guy could have such strength. After hearing what the old beggar said, the three women flashed a little excitement in their eyes. At this time, they turned their heads and stared at the old beggar. Senior, is his dangerous period over? The old beggar nodded gently, and at this time everyone heard a dragon roar, followed by the second and third roars. The dragon roar resounded through the sky, and it seemed to make people feel a natural majesty. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 177. The old beggar just raised his head towards the void and forgot to go up. The purpose of this ordinary person was not to see the 9 golden dragons, but obviously the old beggar was not an ordinary person. He saw the 9 golden dragons hiding in the clouds. In the middle, flying up and down, moving left and right. At this time, the old beggar's eyes were obviously more excited. He nodded with satisfaction, and the smile at the corner of his mouth began to become more and more obvious. Ha ha ha, not bad, it's really good. A group of fiery breath above the void suddenly rushed towards everyone. That breath gave everyone a feeling of fear, and then the old beggar quickly protected the 3 women. The figure suddenly retreated towards the back, but even so, the hot breath still scratched his chest. A mouthful of blood spurted out from the old beggar's mouth. After the 3 women saw the old beggar like this, there was quite a bit of concern in their eyes. Their eyes were fixed on the old beggar, and then they frowned and knitted together. Senior, are you okay? The old beggar turned his head and glanced at the 3 women. His eyes seemed quite complicated, and then he waved his hand in the same way, and then sighed heavily. Alas, this bunch of old bones can't compare with you young people. The corner of the old beggar's mouth evoked a bit of a bitter smile, and a bit of helplessness flashed in his eyes. At this time, he waved his hand like this. After the 3 women saw this scene, they felt quite sad in their hearts. Somewhat apologetic. At this time, the old beggar just smiled and said, "It doesn't matter, he is an old bone himself. As long as it is not broken apart by the tossing, this old bone can still survive." The helplessness in the old beggar's eyes began to become more and more obvious. And just after this moment, Lin Yu suddenly started to do something, and the 9 golden dragons suddenly got into Lin Yu's body. Golden dragon body protection. Suddenly, the surrounding sky was suddenly turbulent. During that period of turmoil, Lin Yu's expression condensed slightly. At this time, he seemed to have remembered something. He turned his head and glanced at the old beggar and Ji-nu. Then he waved his hands like crazy. After seeing Lin Yu like this, the eyes of the old beggar and a few other women flashed with a special light, and then they half closed their eyes with a bit of complexity. "Don't worry, little guy, I will take care of these women for you. As for the others, you don't have to worry. This time, those super sects will definitely come to watch, but don't worry, there is nothing they can do with the old beggar here. If I can't help you, you can just refine these golden dragons with peace of mind." After the old beggar finished speaking, he just waved his hand gently. After hearing what the old beggar said, Lin Yu's eyes flashed with gratitude, and then he started to relax and do such acrylic concentration. But at this moment, Lin Yu heard a voice that seemed to be coming from the sea of his consciousness. The voice was quite majestic. At this time, After hearing those voices, Lin Yu seemed to have a somewhat complicated look in his eyes, and a faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Interesting, it's really interesting. Even now, do you still want to test me? In that case, as you wish, I will let you see how powerful I am. After Lin Yu finished speaking, he made a hand seal with his hands, and then his anger fell from his dantian, and his spirits gathered in Zifu. At this time, he quietly aroused the power of heaven and earth on one side, and everyone felt the power of heaven and earth on that side. A huge amount of pressure. Even Lin Yu had to admit that this time she really wanted to thank the guy from before. If that guy hadn't given her such strength, I'm afraid she wouldn't have been able to fight against the 9 golden dragons now. The 9 golden dragons represent wind, fire, thunder, and lightning, metal, wood, water and fire, and the 5 elements and 4 phenomena. Therefore, if Lin Yu wants to absorb these 9 golden dragons at this time, it is simply a fantasy. At this time, everyone seemed to feel a strong tremor. The earth began to slowly crack, and the spiritual energy in the entire misty forest suddenly rushed toward Lin Yu. The extremely violent energy and the mysterious fierceness made everyone feel uncontrollable. Tianfo men. What's going on? Which little guy made such a big noise? What's going on? Someone tell me. A man wearing Buddhist robes knelt down in front of a Buddha statue. He spoke to Chen Sheng in such a leisurely manner, but the eyes of the man behind him were quite solemn, and something flashed through his eyes. It was a special color, and then he couldn't help but raise his eyebrows slightly. Your Majesty, I don't know exactly what this matter is, but... The old man turned his head and glanced at the man behind him. There was a bit of complexity in his eyes, and there was a bit of coldness between his eyebrows. What's going on? Tell me. The old man slowly turned his head and stared at the man standing behind him. At this moment, the man's mouth curled up a bit of a bitter smile, and his eyes were full of helplessness. Obviously, he didn't know what happened. After all, he was just a servant, and at this time he was racking his brains to think about how to answer. But at this time, a man's voice came, and the man's voice came from far away. The noise seems to come from the misty forest. A man in plain Buddhist clothes walked in slowly. The man looked quite young, about 16 or 17 years old, with red lips and white teeth, and a pretty handsome look. If those women saw it, they would probably be very sad why such a person with a heart of orchid painting would become a monk. After hearing the man's voice, the abbot stood up suddenly, turned his head and looked at the man, his eyes full of respect. I am honored to meet you, Master Jing Ai. At this time, Master Jing Ai just waved his hand casually, with a slight smile in his eyes and a kind face, looking like a gentle scholar. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 178. There is no need to be so polite. How are you doing, Abbot? Master Kengzi just nodded lightly, and he clasped his hands together and performed a Buddhist salute. It's been pretty good lately, but it can cause such a big change. I think it's definitely not an ordinary person. If such a master were born, normally, it would probably cause a huge turmoil, so this situation is absolutely not allowed to happen. Master Kengzi's voice began to become colder and harsher. At this time, his voice began to become even colder, and a bit of gloom flashed in his eyes. At this moment, Master Jing Ai turned his head, glanced at the control area, and then slowly walked outside, followed closely by Master Kengzi. When they came to an open space, Master Jing Ai suddenly smiled. At this time, Master Jing Ai turned his head and glanced towards Master Kengzi, and the corners of his mouth were even more aroused. Ruao's smile. Some things need to be done, but they don't necessarily need to be done by us. For example, when you look at the flying flowers, the falling leaves, everything, and the prosperity of the world, we are all enjoying it, but we don't necessarily have to do it ourselves. Everything is given by the gods, and those who enjoy the gods will eventually have to pay something. Master Jing I just said this unhurriedly, and at this time, after Master Kengzi heard what Master Jing I said, a somewhat complicated light flashed in his eyes, and then he nodded gently. Nodded. What you said is indeed true. Some things are indeed somewhat unclear, and some things, although they are under control, have to be transcended from this worldly world. This is really a headache. At this time, Master Jing I just glanced at the snowy mountain in the southwest direction, with a faint smile on the corner of his mouth, and a flash of light in his eyes. Of excitement. The snow in the Tian Shan Mountains never melts all year round, and the people in the Tian Shan Mountains don't go down the mountain all year round. But on the snow-capped mountains, even though it's a bit cold, ice flowers can bloom. You mean to ask the 7 swordsmen on Tian Shan Mountain to take action? But they have not cared about world affairs for a long time. What if they don't take action? Just because they don't take action doesn't mean that their alien beasts can't be born. Those alien beasts just signed a simple contract with them and they are in an equal relationship. They have no way to control the will of these alien beasts. They just made a fuss. When I heard that movement, I could clearly feel the restlessness of the Buddha lotus beast in my body. Master Jing I spoke unhurriedly, and Master Kengzi quickly agreed. At this time, he nodded heavily, as if he suddenly understood something. I understand what you mean. At this moment, Master Jing I disappeared directly in front of Master Kengzi. A leaf fell slowly. Master Kengzi picked up the leaf and looked at the texture of the leaf. The leaf suddenly disappeared like this. It fell into his palm, as if it had never been in this world. And just after this moment, Master Kengzi also slowly walked towards the temple behind him and walked in. Above the Tian Shan Mountains. In front of a cliff, a man wearing a white robe stood with his hands fluttering. He stood on the top of the cliff. If you look up carefully, you can actually find that this man is floating in the air, with his toes barely an inch above the ground. A faint smile appeared at the corner of the man's mouth, and then he slowly turned his head. Behind him was a man wearing a white gauze gown with long blue hair. The woman with the hair stood quietly behind him. Bing Bing, why do you have the leisure to come to my place? The woman's face seemed to be quite solemn, her eyes were staring at the man, and there were some meaningful smiles on the corners of her mouth. Some things are unknown. After the man heard what the woman said, his eyes seemed quite complicated, and then he couldn't help but raise his eyebrows slightly. Are you talking about the strange movement in the misty forest? The man slowly turned his head and glanced at the woman, with a hint of joking in his eyes. After Situ Ningbing heard what Tuguluakan said, he nodded solemnly, yes, that sudden movement was really weird. I think we should send someone to take a look. People from Tian Shan Mountain are not allowed to come down from the mountain. This is the rule set by Master. However, Master also said that if there is any unusual movement in the west one day, we senior brothers will still have to go down the mountain. The misty forest is just to the west, a lively voice sounded from a distance. A man with a very beautiful appearance and a bit of bookishness walked over slowly. The first impression of this man is not that of a man, but rather that of a charming woman. This man is an everlasting man, and even his appearance will arouse the excitement of many men. Situ Ningbing turned around and glanced at Bailey Changqing. You are still as impetuous as before. Bailey Changqing scratched his head and smiled. Second senior sister, please stop teasing me like this. In my opinion, second senior sister should be more lively. In such a cold temperature, second senior sister's expression can kill someone. Little brother, don't be rude to second senior sister. A young man holding a folding fan gently shook it. The young man had a roe deer chopped by foxes on his body, and his face was a bit sickly pale. There was a sword on his waist, which gave people a feeling of being unfathomable. Old third, What do you think about this matter? Tugaluakan turned his head slowly and looked at Bailey Changkong. Bailey Changkong's face sank slightly, and there seemed to be a little complexity in his eyes. There seemed to be a bit of solemnity in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. At this time, he couldn't help but shake his head slightly. It's hard to say, I don't know how to mention this matter, but sometimes, some things can't be said. Bailey Changkong said it slowly, and no one around could understand it. But it's no wonder that Bailey Changkong made such a riddle, and few people could understand the meaning of it. At this time, Tugaluakan's eyes narrowed into a slit, and there seemed to be a bit of complexity in his eyes. He also took a deep breath. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 179. Then what do you think we should do now? Go down the mountain or not? Of course we have to go down the mountain. After all, the master's death was placed there. As for whether that person is an enemy or a friend, you will know it as soon as you come down the mountain. A man holding a long sword and carrying a dark iron heavy sword behind his back said like this walked over slowly. Every time this man took a step, the surrounding earth seemed to tremble faintly. Everyone just turned their heads and glanced at the man with a bit of respect in their eyes. This man was shirtless, but in this extremely cold place, he didn't even show the slightest hint of coldness. This really makes people a little unpredictable about this man. Situ Ningbing glanced at the man. Is it cold? At this time, the man scratched his head and smiled honestly, just like a simple and honest big boy next door. Of course it's not cold. What did sister say? At this moment, the man also turned his head and glanced at Situ Ningbing, with a somewhat complicated look in his eyes. But now, the world is in turmoil. If such a turbulent situation goes downhill, if something really happens, we won't be able to say anything. A man came stepping on the flying snow. The man landed lightly, and then he glanced at the crowd, with a wry smile on his lips, and his eyes were full of helplessness. What the second brother said is indeed true. The safest way now is to send someone down the mountain to see how the world is doing before making other decisions. The man turned his head and glanced at Situ Ningbing. Almost everyone's eyes were fixed on Situ Ningbing. At this time, Situ Ningbing also had a helpless smile on his lips, and a hint of helplessness flashed in his eyes. Oh, I know you guys, since you have said it all, let me go down the mountain this time. Situ Ningbing said this unhurriedly. Tugaluakan glanced at Situ Ningbing. You are calm and have superb swordsmanship. The most important thing is your ice and snow beast. It seems that it has been stuck in the epic realm for a long time. If you go down the mountain to experience it this time, you may break through the legend. This is also a great opportunity for you. After Tugaluakan finished speaking, Situ Ningbing also nodded solemnly. Yes, senior brother is absolutely right. At this moment, Bailey Changkong turned around and glanced at Situ Ningbing, with a somewhat complicated look in his eyes. There is one more thing you must know. Situ Ningbing frowned slightly. Very few things could make the third junior brother change his expression. But this time, the third junior brother's face was full of solemnity, and she knew that this matter was unusual. Situ Ningbing glanced at Bailey Changkong, and then nodded solemnly. You tell me what it is. It is very likely that the Tianfo sect will send Jing Ai this time. That guy has an extraordinary mind, and the Buddha lotus beast he sat on may have already entered the realm of legend. Back then, the Tianfo sect always wanted to take over our Tianshan mountains. I have it, now I'm afraid I won't let this opportunity go. If they really dare to attack our Tianshan mountains, I will not let them go without the black iron ruler in my hand. Situ Qingfeng suddenly pulled out the heavy black iron ruler he was carrying behind him. When the heavy iron ruler was unsheathed, the surrounding wind and snow were split into two halves in an instant. A majestic and vast force suddenly shot across the sky, and the snowy mountain in front of them was instantly cut away. The violent and fierce force made everyone couldn't help but stretch out their hands and admire it. Xiaoqi, why are you so impulsive again? Being so impulsive is not a good thing. After Sidu Qingfeng heard what Tuguluakan said, he lowered his head like this at that time. He buried his head very low, and there was a bit of dodge in his eyes. Brother is right, I didn't control my temper this time, please calm down. Tuguluakan patted Sidu Qingfeng's shoulder so gently, something complicated seemed to flash in his eyes, and then he smiled slightly. My skills have improved recently, which is also a good thing. After hearing the compliment, Sidu Qingfeng also smiled like this. His smile was quite honest, and Tuguluakan's eyes also flashed a bit of complexity. Wuji sect. It seems that things are not going to be peaceful in the world. In these troubled times, it is easiest to make achievements. Now I can no longer hold the long sword in my hand. If you can't help it, calm down your temper. Your temper is too impetuous now. This is not good, very bad. A man slowly walked out from the depths like this. The man was wearing a yellow robe. When he came in front of the leader of the Wuji sect, the leader of the Wuji sect suddenly fell to his knees like this. Among them, there is quite a bit of respect. The man turned his head towards the leader of the Wuji sect and glanced coldly, with a hint of a faint smile on his lips. You have always been known to act like this on the surface. Do you think I don't know what you say about me behind my back? The man's eyes were quite cold, and in his expression, the beautiful woman had a murderous aura. At this time, his eyes were fixed on the Wuji sect master, and just after this moment, a layer of cold sweat instantly appeared on the back of the Wuji sect master. At this time, he shook his head with his hands bare. Even if I have the courage to do so, I will never dare to say bad things about you behind your back. Please don't listen to those villains. They just can't stand the good relationship between me and the Lord, so they want to sow discord between me and the Lord. After hearing what the Wuji sect master said, the man turned his head slowly, staring at the Wuji sect master, and a faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. A cold murderous intent suddenly rose from his body. Are you serious? But I don't think you are such a person. The Wuji sect master was so tearful at that time, his eyes were full of helplessness, and a bitter smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. It is absolutely true. I would never dare to say anything false. Please understand. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 180. And at this moment, the third prince suddenly opened his eyes, a bit of cold murderous intent flashed in his eyes, his brows were tightened together, and the murderous intent on his body was even more vague. Nothing is revealed. At this moment, the third prince seemed to have remembered something. He turned his head towards the head of the Wuji sect, and just glanced coldly, with a bit of coldness flashing in his eyes. Murderous intent, a cold aura spread from his body so quietly. Of course, the leader of the Wuji sect at this time understood that this man was probably really angry. At this time, the leader of the Wuji sect also had a bitter smile on his lips. He was shaking all over, and there was a hint of panic in his eyes. The meaning cannot be concealed at all. Don't be afraid, I can only kill those losers. Do you think you will be one of those losers? The third prince's eyes were staring straight at the leader of the Wuji sect, with a bit of ice flashing in his eyes and a bit of frost forming on his brows. At this moment, the leader of Wuji sect seemed to suddenly understand something. I just heard a few days ago that a boy who has been against us seems to have gone in the direction of the misty forest. Calculating the time, this incident should have happened when he came here. The head of the Wuji sect stared straight at the third prince with a bit of panic in his eyes. At this moment, the third prince nodded with satisfaction, and a faint smile appeared on the corner of his mouth. Very well, it would have been better if you had told me this earlier. Now I see that you are quite sincere, but there is something I still want to tell you. After the leader of the Waji sect heard what the third prince said, his face suddenly froze and there was a hint of panic in his eyes, but at this time he nodded subconsciously. Please tell me something. At this moment, the corners of the third prince's mouth evoked a somewhat meaningful smile. It's very simple. I know that you are secretly training your own dead soldiers. I heard that you have trained a lot of them. Lend them to me. Don't worry, I will. It won't be in vain. The third prince's eyes were staring straight at the leader of the Waji section at this time. After hearing what the third prince said, the leader of the Waji sect had a bit of panic in his eyes. At this moment, he seemed to as if he remembered something, his brows sank slightly. But at this time, the third prince heard this sound, but then his face suddenly became ugly, and the pressure on him was fully revealed. You don't agree? The third prince's eyes were fixed on the leader of the Waji section at this time. The leader of the Waji sect was filled with panic and fear. After a moment, a wry smile appeared on the corner of his mouth. I agree, of course I agree, how dare I not agree? At this time, the third prince also nodded with satisfaction, with a faint smile on the corner of his mouth, and then waved his hand gently. I know you are a useful person. I will never kill those useful people, so you can rest assured of your own safety. After the third prince finished speaking at this time, he turned around and left. The leader of the Waji sect stared at the back of the third prince with a somewhat complicated look in his eyes. At this moment, he also took a deep breath. Calmed down his mood a little, and there seemed to be a bit of sigh in his eyes. Oh, fortunately, I finally escaped a disaster, otherwise it would have been really troublesome. But a moment later, the third prince actually turned back again. At this moment, the head of the Waji sect had a bit of fear in his eyes. His eyes were staring straight at the corners of the third prince's eyes and eyebrows. It was one of the indescribable fears. At this time, he forced a smile from the corner of his mouth. Third prince, you. The third prince turned his head towards the leader of the Waji sect and gave him a cold glance. His eyes and brows flashed, showing a bit of cold light and a bit of cold murderous intent on his body. You seemed very happy when I left just now. Do you need me to make you happy again now? The third prince's eyes were as bright as a torch. There was a bit of coldness in his eyes, and the sharp killing intent in his body was suddenly revealed. This cold killing intent enveloped Waji. On the body of the sect master, the Waji sect master just swallowed his saliva at this moment, and then he knelt down on the ground again. No, of course not. How could I be happy if you left? Look at what you said. After the third prince heard what the leader of Waji sect said, he turned his head and glanced in his direction, with a hint of snow in his eyes and a sneer on his lips. Are you telling the truth? There was a bit of coldness in the third prince's eyes. And at this moment, the head of Waji sect nodded as if this little chicken was pecking at rice. Of course it's true. The third prince nodded so lightly, with a bit of satisfaction in his eyes, and then he waved his hand, and after a moment he actually laughed. At this time, the third prince slowly helped the leader of Waji sect up. Why are you so scared? I won't eat people, right? At this time, the third prince said slowly. But at this moment, the leader of Waji sect was sweating profusely, because he really couldn't figure out what the third prince was up to. At this time, the leader of Waji sect just nodded heavily. Yes, you are right, the third prince is benevolent to the world, and the royal family will last forever. The third prince just waved his hand lightly, and then a sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth. Very good, I am very satisfied with your answer this time. If so, I will withdraw for the time being, and wait until tomorrow. I hope you can still do this. For some reason, the leader of Waji sect suddenly had an ominous premonition in his heart, and a layer of dense cold sweat appeared on his forehead. At this time, he nodded heavily, and a bit of fear flashed in his eyes.